He fired one shot into the air. The flashlights froze. And in the silence that followed, Walter Kane, 72 years old, standing alone in the dark between an old fence line and four armed men, said calmly, "Next one's lower. Get back in your trucks." Before the last truck pulled away, a window came down. A voice said, "This isn't over, old man." Walter watched the taillights disappear. Then he turned to the field where three bleeding strangers were hiding and said, "I've got a barn and a first aid kit. You boys want to stay in the cold, or you want some help?" He had no idea those three men were about to change his life forever. Walter Kane had grown up in Clairton, Pennsylvania, the kind of town where people still waved at strangers and left their porch lights on. He joined the Army at 18, came back at 20 with a Purple Heart and a quietness nobody could quite reach. He married a woman named Ruth. They built a life on 40 acres, a farmhouse, a barn, a vegetable garden Ruth planted the first summer they moved in. It was a simple life. It was a good one. And then 5 years before this story begins, Ruth got sick. And within 8 months, she was gone. After Ruth passed, the house got very quiet. His son Derek lived an hour away in Pittsburgh, but they hadn't spoken properly in 3 years. A Thanksgiving disagreement that neither man had been willing to walk back from. Walter didn't dwell on it out loud. He just kept repairing fences, helping neighbors, making coffee he let go cold. He told himself that was enough. The neighbors would tell you he never complained, never asked for help, never let anyone see the weight he carried. Which is exactly why, when he stepped off that porch with a rifle at midnight, nobody who knew him was surprised. That was just Walter. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's get back to that night. The men bleeding in Walter's field were Iron Ravens, a motorcycle club out of Columbus, Ohio. Cole Maddox, 38, former Army combat medic, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Ethan Briggs, 42, high school history teacher, Army veteran, a man who once told his club brothers that riding was the only thing that kept him sane after coming home. And Mason Reed, 35, the youngest who'd taken a hit to the leg when the ambush started and was now dragging himself through frozen grass, trying to stay ahead of the men, still moving through the dark behind him. They weren't criminals. They'd spent 4 days helping a sister chapter move elderly veterans out of a predatory assisted living facility in western Pennsylvania, a place that had been forging documents and overcharging residents to strip them of their properties. The kind of work the Ravens did without fanfare, without press releases. They showed up, they helped, and they left. That night, they were heading home on back roads when 2 pickup trucks came out of nowhere, cut them off, and men with rifles climbed out. Cole's bike went down first, then Ethan's. Mason lasted another 100 yards before a tire blew. If you were Mason in that moment, leg shot, brothers down, no signal, no help coming, what would you do? That's the question Walter's porch light answered. He didn't run toward the trucks. He moved along the fence line, low and quiet, the way the Army had taught him 50 years ago and the way the body never fully unlearns. He could see 4 men sweeping flashlight beams through the grass, organized and methodical. They weren't expecting anyone to come at them from the side they hadn't covered. Walter stopped, raised his rifle, and fired once, into the air, clean and deliberate. Every flashlight froze. Then, in a flat, unhurried voice, he said, "Next one's lower. Get back in your trucks." There was a pause, the kind that happens when men have to recalculate a situation they didn't plan for. Walter didn't move. His breath was steady. Then the men near the trucks started pulling back. Engines turned over, and headlights swept the road as the pickups reversed into the dark. Before the last one disappeared, a window came down and a voice said, almost casual, "This isn't over, old man." Walter watched the taillights shrink and vanish. Then he walked to the fence line and called out into the field. "I've got a barn and a first aid kit. You boys want to keep laying in the cold, or you want some help?" It took a few seconds. Then 3 shapes rose from the grass and started moving toward him. If you believe bullies always eventually meet the wrong person, hit that like button and subscribe. People who prey on the vulnerable count on silence. Walter Kane refused to be silent, and there's a lot more to this story. Keep watching. Walter cleaned and wrapped Mason's leg before he asked a single question. Combat medic meets combat veteran. They both understood the order of operations. Stop the bleeding first. Talk later. Cole stood at the barn door, watching the road through the gap in the slats. Nobody said much that first hour. Just the sound of Mason breathing through the pain and the barn settling in the cold. When Walter finally handed out mugs of coffee, Cole looked at him and said, "You didn't have to do that." Walter handed him the mug and said, "I know." 2 words. No speech, no explanation. Just 2 words that said everything. That Walter understood the risk, had taken it anyway, and didn't need a thank you. Cole stared at his coffee a long moment. Then he asked Walter his name. That was how it started. They talked through the early hours the way people only talk when the adrenaline has faded and what's left is just the truth. Cole mentioned his father, a man named Ray Maddox, Army, early 70s. Walter went still at the name, but didn't say anything yet. Ethan talked about PTSD, about the years after his second deployment when 3 hours of sleep was a good night, and the only place he felt calm was on a bike moving fast on an empty road. Mason stayed quiet most of the time, but at one point he looked at Walter and said, "My dad left when I was 9. Never came back." Walter just nodded once. That nod held more than most men could have put into a full conversation. Close to 3 in the morning, Walter said, "I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a man was dying alone. Then Ruth passed, and I figured out the worst thing is living like you already did." The barn went quiet. All 3 men understood exactly what he meant. Have you ever felt like that? Like you were already disappearing before anything had actually taken you? Because more people are living that way right now than anyone wants to admit. Morning came, and with phone signal restored, Cole started making calls. What came back was worse than any of them expected. The men in those trucks were connected to a developer named Gareth Holloway, a name appearing regularly in property disputes across 3 western Pennsylvania counties. His operation was straightforward and ruthless. Target elderly landowners, particularly veterans, use forged documents and legal pressure to force acquisitions at a fraction of real value and move on to the next one. The Iron Ravens, by documenting the assisted living facility, had accidentally photographed men connected to Holloway's operation on properties they had no legal right to be on. The ambush wasn't random. It was damage control. Then Cole pulled up county land records and turned his phone toward Walter. 40 acres, farmhouse included, under review for compulsory acquisition, filed 3 weeks prior, bearing Walter's signature on a property survey he had never signed. Walter looked at it. Then he set the phone on the table, looked out the window at the field where Ruth's garden used to be, and said, "I've spent my whole life standing my ground. I'm not starting retirement by running." 2 days later, Holloway's men came back, not with rifles this time. Just a message. A section of fence torn out. 3 chickens missing. A formal acquisition offer left on the porch at an insulting number, with a handwritten note beneath it. Think it over. Walter read it, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. Then he went inside and called Cole Maddox. Cole had been pulling on something since that first night in the barn. His father, Ray Maddox, had told him a story more than once about a man from his Vietnam unit who had pulled him out of an ambush that should have killed him. Ray had never said the man's name. He just described him quiet, Western Pennsylvania, a farmer's son, moved like he was always listening for something. Cole had grown up with that story. He just never had a name to put to it until now. One call to a veterans service organization, one call to a military records contact he'd built over years of advocacy work, and 48 hours later, Cole had his confirmation. Walter Kane had served in the same unit as Ray Maddox. The incident his father had described matched Walter's service record almost exactly. Walter had saved Ray Maddox's life in Vietnam. And 50 years later, Ray Maddox's son had stumbled bleeding into Walter's field in the dark. When Cole told him, Walter sat down at the kitchen table and didn't speak for a long time. Then, quietly, "How is he?" "Your dad." Cole said, "He passed 4 years ago. Lung cancer." Walter nodded slowly. "He was one of the best men I ever served with," he said. Cole had to clear his throat twice before he could answer. Some debts skip a generation before they find their way home. This one just had. The evidence the Ravens had collected went to a contact in the state attorney general's office. A veteran the club had helped years earlier who had never forgotten it. What came back was a case file that had been sitting undeveloped for nearly 2 years. Holloway's operation wasn't a few isolated incidents. It was a coordinated system running across 3 counties. At minimum, 14 documented cases of veterans defrauded out of their land, and an unknown number of cases where elderly owners had simply signed papers they didn't fully understand and been quietly displaced. Walter's forged survey was one of 6 active filings. The notary whose stamp appeared on the document had no record of ever processing it and no memory of signing it. This had been running a long time, and Holloway had gotten comfortable. That comfort was about to cost him everything. Ethan Briggs had made a phone call he hadn't told Walter about. He'd tracked down Derek Kane in Pittsburgh, called him at work, and laid it out plainly. "Your father helped 3 strangers at real personal risk. Those strangers have now learned his land is being targeted by a fraud operation, and he's facing it alone." Derek was quiet on the line for a long moment. Then he said, "How bad is it?" Ethan said, "Bad enough that we thought you should know." 3 days later, Walter pulled up to the farmhouse and found a rental car parked out front. Derek was standing on the porch, jacket too light for the weather, looking like he'd driven fast and hadn't stopped to figure out what to say. They looked at each other across the yard. 3 years of silence between them, hanging in the air like weather. Walter walked up to the porch steps and said, "You want some coffee?" Derek said, "Yeah, Ido." They went inside. Whatever happened in that kitchen stayed between them. But Derek's car was still there the next morning. What Walter didn't know was that the Iron Ravens hadn't just called Derek. They'd called everyone. Every chapter they trusted, every club they'd worked alongside, every contact across every state who understood what the Ravens stood for and what was happening to a 72-year-old veteran in Clairton, Pennsylvania. The message was simple. One of our own put himself on the line for 3 brothers. He's fighting to keep his land. He doesn't know we're coming. Walter woke up the morning after Derek arrived, made his coffee, looked out the window, and stopped. There was a bike at the end of his drive. Then another. Then, as the light grew and he stood there unable to look away, more came, single file off the highway, turning in, filling the gravel drive. spreading out across the field. He stepped outside in his coat and stood on the porch watching. Derek came out behind him. They stood there side by side, and neither of them said a word. 112 motorcycles by the time the last one parked. No aggression. No threats directed at anyone. Just people. Men and women who had driven from Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, New York, standing in silence on the property of a man most of them had never met. Cole Maddox walked up to the porch steps, looked Walter in the eye, and said, "You stood for 3 of us. Today we stand for you." Walter looked at him. Then he looked out at the field full of bikes, full of strangers who had taken days off work and ridden across state lines because an old man had walked into the dark and refused to let 3 people die in his field. And Walter Kane, a man who hadn't cried at his wife's funeral because he needed to hold it together for everyone else, sat down on the top step, put his face in his hands, and wept. Not for grief, not from fear, because he had spent 5 years telling himself that the life left to him after Ruth was already over. And now 112 people were standing in his field proving him wrong. The evidence went to the Attorney General's office, the FBI field office in Pittsburgh, and 3 investigative journalists at the same time. Holloway's legal team tried to slow it down. They didn't succeed. Within 10 days, federal investigators opened a formal inquiry. Within 3 weeks, the first arrest came. Walter's property filing was voided. 14 families had their cases reopened. A man who had spent years targeting people he believed had no one quietly discovered how badly he had miscalculated what no one actually means. Derek didn't go back to Pittsburgh right away. He stayed 6 weeks. He helped Walter fix the fence. He cleared the weeds from Ruth's old garden without being asked. He and Walter didn't resolve everything. 3 years of silence doesn't dissolve in a week, and neither of them were men who spoke easily about the things that hurt. But they ate dinner together every night, and that was a start. Cole came back one Saturday in early spring. He brought a photograph, framed, found in a box of his father's belongings. 2 young soldiers squinting against bright sun somewhere overseas. On the back, in Ray Maddox's handwriting, asterisk Ray and Walt. The day we made it out, asterisk Walter looked at it for a long time. Then he put on the mantle next to Ruth's picture. That's where it stayed. Would you have opened that door? Not as a hypothetical. Your house, your porch, your dark field, and gunshots you didn't ask for. What do you actually do? And what if you found out later that one of those strangers was carrying proof of a debt that had been waiting 50 years to come home? How would that land? Think about where Walter was before that night. Alone, shrinking, quietly convincing himself that his story was already over. And think about everything that came back to him because he refused to stay inside. His land, his son, a photograph, 112 people in his field on a cold morning standing there for him. One decision at midnight, one act of basic decency, and it echoed further than anyone could have planned. What's your take on this? Drop in the comments. I'm reading every single one. If this story hit you, hit the like and send it to someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, the previous videos are on the channel. Because sometimes the greatest family you'll ever find isn't the one you were born into. It's the one that shows up when the world turns its back on you.